For centuries, the Habsburg family basically ruled all of Central Europe. I mean, they had this massive multicultural empire that, from the outside, looked absolutely invincible, right? But fast forward to 1918 and boom, this ancient superpower completely shatters into a bunch of fragile ethno-states. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going way beyond your standard history class. We're going to uncover exactly how and why this absolute titan of Europe actually fell apart. Because, spoiler alert, the seeds of its destruction were planted long before any shots were actually fired.
Okay, let's dive into this, because honestly, the standard textbook narrative, it kind of gets it wrong. Most of us are taught that the whole thing just collapsed because of an assassination and World War I. But that is literally just a fraction of the truth. The reality is, the empire was already rotting from the inside out. So what we're doing today is basically a structural autopsy of that internal rot. We're going to see how a fatally flawed, super bureaucratic system actually doomed the empire from the start.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the illusion of invincibility, the flawed dual monarchy, a fractured economy, the ethnic powder keg, the final spark, and finally, the legacy.
All right, Section 1, the illusion of invincibility, a giant rotting from within.
Moving on to Part 2, the flawed dual monarchy, or the Patchwork Foundation. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is how their very foundation became their biggest structural weakness. You see, to anyone looking in, the Habsburgs projected this vibe of absolute, unbreakable control over Central Europe. But that giant map? Totally an illusion. By 1867, the monarchy was actually bleeding power fast. So to keep this massive empire from completely falling apart, they had to make a really drastic compromise. They basically sliced the empire's management right down the middle. This created what we call a dual monarchy. So, the Austrian Empire on one side and the Kingdom of Hungary on the other. It was a total desperation move just to hang on to control.
And in practice, it was incredibly messy. They shared a single monarch, a unified military, and foreign policy. But literally almost everything else, all the domestic management, was completely separate. Just imagine trying to run a massive global business where your two co-CEOs absolutely refuse to speak the same language, have totally different economic goals, and honestly, just actively dislike each other. It's like a boardroom where half the executives are secretly plotting against the other half of the water cooler. That absolute absurdity was the actual day-to-day reality of the Austro-Hungarian government.
But here is where that co-CEO structure became a true bureaucratic nightmare, the number 10. Because of this deeply divided system, Austria and Hungary had to renegotiate their financial agreements every 10 years. Now, you might think, just routine paperwork, right? No way. These negotiations inevitably devolved into intense, nail-biting political hostage situations, every single time. Both sides would just weaponize the deadline to threaten the other, which meant passing any meaningful empire-wide reform was practically impossible. They were structurally gridlocked by design.
Which brings us to Part 3. A fractured economy, factories versus feudalism. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive divide they created. The economic disparities caused by all this gridlock were just extreme. On the Austrian side, especially in places like Bohemia, which is modern-day Czechia, the economy was exploding with rapid industrialization. I mean, they're building factories, laying down massive railway networks, creating a modern capitalist workforce, the whole shebang. But then you look over at the Hungarian side, and it is a completely different world. The elites over there basically ran a feudal agrarian society. They fiercely protected these massive farming estates and showed literally zero interest in building factories or, giving their peasant class any actual rights. So you effectively had one half of the empire rushing headfirst into the 20th century, while the other half was stubbornly clinging to the 18th century.
Section 4. The ethnic powder keg, suppression and nationalism.
Now, as bad as the bureaucratic and economic divides were, the empire had a much, much more fatal flaw. The Austro-Hungarian Empire wasn't just made up of Austrians and Hungarians. So you have to ask, what about the rest of the empire? What about the millions of other people living trapped inside these massive borders? Because for centuries, this empire ruled over a huge array of populations, and a massive chunk of them were Slavic citizens.
And here's the thing. These Slavic populations definitely did not see themselves as just quiet, obedient subjects of the Habsburgs. Not at all. They viewed themselves as distinct ethnicities with their own vibrant cultures, histories, and traditions. And they really, really wanted a unified, independent state run by their own people.
But the leadership in Vienna and Budapest, they completely failed to adapt to this rising tide of nationalism. They had absolutely no intention of giving up territory just so the Slavs could have their own nation. So, instead of granting equal representation, the central government just chose to suppress them. Millions of people were effectively trapped as second-class citizens in their own homeland. By just ignoring their voices, the empire basically turned itself into a giant powder keg, just waiting for a spark.
Part 5. The final spark. Climax and collapse. Let's move ahead and see how this all builds up to a breaking point.
The pressure cooker environment inside the empire was just completely unsustainable. When the war kicks off in 1914, the Austro-Hungarian military immediately occupies neighboring Serbia and Montenegro. But total war acts as the ultimate stress test, and it's a test the empire severely fails. By the middle of the war, the strain of it all totally shatters their fragile dual monarchy system. The economy completely tanks, the military takes catastrophic losses, and central authority just straight up evaporates. By early 1918, the empire is literally violently tearing itself apart. We're talking revolutions erupting right in the streets of Vienna and Budapest, the very capitals, and seeing that the central authority is effectively dead, the various ethnic groups finally make their move. By late 1918, Czechia and Slovakia declare their independence, and the southern Slavs follow suit right after.
So this brings us to a really stark new reality. The old reality was basically all these suppressed Slavic territories locked tightly within the borders of Austria-Hungary. But the new reality? The southern Slavic territories broke away entirely and joined forces with the newly liberated Serbia and Montenegro. Together, they officially formed the independent kingdom of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. And this monumental shift was actually heavily supported by the victorious Allied powers. They absolutely loved the idea of taking the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and breaking it up into smaller, weaker countries.
Section 6. The Legacy. Anatomy of a Failure. So, the crucial point we need to understand is, as we look back at the actual mechanics of this history, it becomes super clear that the military defeat was really just the final blow to a structure that had already crumbled. Ultimately, the Austro-Hungarian Empire legislated itself into extinction. By trying to manage a dozen different national identities without ever creating a single unifying purpose, the Habsburgs doomed their central authority way before the final shots of World War I were ever fired. The rigid bureaucracy, the extreme economic divisions, and that stubborn refusal to adapt to rising nationalism, it all just created a machine that simply couldn't survive under pressure.
I want to leave you with this final thought. A government that relies on rigid compromises will inevitably shatter. That right there is the ultimate systemic lesson of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When a government completely ignores the basic economic and cultural needs of its people just to maintain a paralyzed bureaucracy, collapse isn't just a possibility. It's an absolute inevitability. So what happens to modern nations when they prioritize bureaucratic gridlock over the actual needs of their citizens? Well, it's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.